It will be available in several weeks. And without further ado, I'm going to let Kirsten introduce Dr. Seiler and welcome everyone.
Thank you, Colleen, and thank you to all of you for coming, and especially thank you to Dr. John Seiler for gracing us with his presence tonight. We are so very fortunate to have his expertise today. Some of you may have seen him speak at the Master Gardener College a couple of years ago. I was one of those people, and it was very lovely, and I'm so very happy that our Continuing Education Committee has reached out to Dr. Seiler to convince him to come to us tonight. Dr. Seiler is a very popular educator at Virginia Tech. He teaches 4 classes, and he was named a University Alumni Distinguished Professor in recognition of his teaching and research. And in fact, he was one of 9 educators at Virginia Tech honored as a spotlight of the Center for Excellence in Teaching Spotlight, for which only 9 faculty members get chosen. He has wonderful relationship with the students, and one of them said about his teaching that he combined the best of experiential education, knowledge, and hands-on training that was so very valuable to actually learning what the subject matter needed to be taught. And Dr. Seiler is known around the world, around the US even, as Dr. Dendro. And if you've ever gone onto the Virginia Tech site to look for information about trees, you will see Dr. Dendro's websites. But he personally answers these hundreds of tree-related questions that come across every day, every year, every week. And much like our help desk, this app is available on both Android and iOS, and it's free. VTree, VTREE. He has led a team that has developed numerous award-winning multimedia tutorials for tree identification, and these are excellent tree identification materials. Certainly has placed Virginia Tech as the #1 website for tree identification. I hope that you'll enjoy his presentation tonight, and as Colin said, there's time for questions. So thank you, Dr. Seiler.
Yeah, thank you for your very kind words. I always joke that it's loosely based on a true story, but thanks very much. As they said, if you do have a question and you're comfortable turning your mic on, don't feel like you're interrupting. Just say, hey, I've got a question, and we'll see how that goes. If we start getting too many, maybe we'll go back to putting them in the chat. We'll just kind of see how that goes. So my title there, the eating, drinking, and gossip, that'll kind of explain itself as we make our way down through this. Sometimes you're going to see the side of my head like this, because that's another monitor that's really, really big. And this one where the camera is really small, and I can't often see it as good. So I'll oftentimes be looking over this way. So it's not like I'm turning my back on you. I just don't have a camera on that one. Okay, so let's start off with some basics about the forests of Virginia. Virginia's got about 15.7 million acres of forest land. And that picture there, as it says, is taken in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And it's very, very diverse forest land because we have a very, very diverse geology and many physiographic regions in Virginia. But here in 15.7 million acres, if you're anything like me, you hear numbers like that and you're like, yeah, that's big. Oh, I don't know if that's big or not. So a percent's often kind of better. So what percent of Virginia is forested? Now, throughout my talk, if you want to get a little scratch piece of paper out and a pencil, I'm going to have set up 10 questions that are multiple choice questions, and they're just kind of for fun. And you can just keep track of how many you get right, and we'll kind of check at the end, to see hey, did anybody get 10 out of 10 right? And so there's a little caution there. We don't want to get into any arguments about the answers. You know, some of these are off from the internet, and so you know how that goes, right? So you may have a different number sometimes, but we're just going to stick with whatever my answer is, okay? Because it's just kind of for fun. And for an example, this is a warm-up one. So what percent of Virginia is forested after all? And all the pictures that are on all these things, they're all Virginia forests throughout. Sometimes they'll have small labels on them, other times they won't. But that's Little Stony Creek going up to the Cascades in the New River Valley. Maybe some of you have visited the Cascades waterfall. It's a 30-foot waterfall, and that's about halfway going to it on a walk on a very cold winter day. So you don't have to guess. I've got some percents for you. So this is our practice one. Is it 58% forested? If we shoved all the forest into one side, would we be about half the state? 62%. You hate that. That's only a 4% difference. Makes it kind of difficult to discern. But you guys are master naturalists after all. So you have to see if you have to discern a 4% difference. 51%. Or is it 69%? So we won't take a long time, just kind of like pick your answer. And if you want to keep track, do that. If not, just kind of follow along. But the answer is 62%. Now, as Sharon, before we started, sometimes I use an app where people have to log in and select their answer. And that gets kind of fun because I can actually ask who's the one person that said 69? You have to kind of identify yourself, but we're not going to be asking that. We'll just at the end see how you did. So 62%, and that often surprises people because you think in the East, the forest is all cut up and there's large metropolitan areas like Northern Virginia, Richmond, Tidewater, but we're still at 62%, and that's been holding steady for the last several decades. Now, what might be a little more surprising is in 1940, the state was only 58% forested. So we've actually gone up. So sometimes I have another follow-up question. Has our percent gone up or gone down since 1940? And we're actually 4% higher. And that's largely due to more farm abandonment after the war, World War II. And then that of course, was either replanted, or if you walk away from a field, it quickly goes back to forest. So we're actually up 4%. From 1940. And a lot of people think how could that be? But it's that. It's still kind of holding steady. And a lot of these numbers you're going to hear tonight, they're real numbers, or as real as you can get. Every state in the United States gets surveyed by something called the Forest Inventory Assessment Program. In short, we talk about in the building here, FIA data, Forest Inventory Assessment. And so it's like a census of the forest every 10 years. So they do 5 states a year. And throughout the state of Virginia and all other states, there's permanent kind of secret plots. No one knows where they are except the FIA people. And they go back, they ask permission to come on. And sometimes they go back and it's a cornfield or it's a Target parking lot, or an Applebee's restaurant sitting there now. And other times it reverted back to forest. And so these numbers all come from that inventory data. Most of the numbers I'm going to be sharing tonight. So they're about as real as you can get. So 62% forested. But then another thing that comes up with regard to the forests of Virginia is what percent is actually in hardwoods or softwoods. Now, those are kind of 2 slang words. Hardwoods are the conifers or the evergreens, the gymnosperms, and the softwoods are, and the hardwoods are the angiosperms or the deciduous trees that turn pretty color in the fall. There's a sprinkling there of what we call softwood trees in that picture. So what do you think that is? I got some choices for you here. 83% hardwood, 17% softwoods, 68% hardwood, and 32% evergreens or softwood trees, 79% hardwood and 21% softwoods, or 61% hardwoods and 39% softwoods. So if you're playing along, select A, B, C, or D, and then just kind of mark it as just like I did next. I'll show you the answer in just a second. So pick your answer. And we are actually at 79% hardwood and 21% softwoods. And that's number doesn't vary a whole lot as you go up and down the whole Appalachian region. Like Pennsylvania is not much different. North Carolina is not much different. You got to get in the east, you got to get up into the boreal forest before the softwood number starts creeping up higher. But, you know, we do have pitch pine and table mountain pine and loblolly pine. You'll hear more about some of those species as we move down through the presentation.
Dr. Seiler?
Yeah.
There was a question about how much, if any, of the forested area you're talking about would be considered virgin forest.
Oh,
and when would that be dated back to?
Yeah, so like old growth. That's very, very rare. That's probably 1% or even lower, because everything in the east, pretty much, I'm gonna have to make a little educated guess. Probably about at least 80% of the forest in Virginia is between 90 and 110 years old right now. Like if you drive along all the interstates, everything's about like that. Not counting loblolly pine plantations, which get harvested like every 20 years. That's kind of growing trees like corn. But as you get into this, a place that's 79% hardwoods, 21% softwood, like the Appalachian Mountains, get into the mountains. The average is about 100 to 110 years old because everything was cut. So probably old growth virgin under 1%. It's extremely rare. And
thank you.
Yeah, and most of that is in really rugged, difficult to reach areas, which is why it never got cut. So a lot of times people can't even, without a pretty good hike, you can't even go in and see a lot of these areas that are old growth. So very, very low amount. Now, I alluded at this just a moment ago. Virginia is really diverse in their forests. We have very, very high biodiversity. And that's not solely due to this, but largely due to the fact that we have great diversity and physiography. You know, we have the coastal plain. Then as you move inwards, you got your Piedmont. We have the Blue Ridge Mountains. That's different rock than the valley and ridge, which is where Blacksburg's at, but that's very mountainous too. And then you get into, we actually are fortunate that we get a little sliver. Do you guys see my cursor? I think, is that moving on that? You might not.
No, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, so I can't, I'm not going to be pointing to it, but the Allegheny Plateau mostly is, you got to be in West Virginia for that, and Western Pennsylvania, and Western Pennsylvania and Eastern Tennessee and Eastern Kentucky. So we get a little corner of that down in the far Southwest Virginia. And all that has different soils, different elevations, different aspect, which way the mountains are facing. And that leads to really, really great diversity in the plants. And then that leads to great diversity in the animal species. And that's largely due to some of the things I was just mentioning there, elevation, aspect, and geology. Your geology gives you a certain soil type, more acid, more basic, high in nitrogen, low in nitrogen. There's a million combinations, and that leads to different plant communities that can grow in that. So high geological diversity results in very, very high plant diversity, which largely dictates the animal diversity. The plants kind of, what's first, the chicken or the egg? Plants kind of lead to what kind of animals you get. And again, all the pictures of all the different trees and animals here, they're all native to Virginia. Up there on the animal up there on the far right is a timber rattlesnake. So that's one of 3 poisonous snakes in the state of Virginia. Okay, now just a little bit about the eating and the drinking and the gossip. Well, we're not going to talk about my research other than just to give you a broad overview. That my research is basically on tree eating behavior, and eating is through the process of photosynthesis. And so up there in the upper left side of that slide, that's us measuring photosynthesis in the canopy of a loblolly pine tree. You know, we have studies where we go up in scaffolding to reach the trees. Sometimes we clip foliage out. Other times we work with small trees, but I spend a lot of time measuring photosynthesis, and that's what that's doing. And then you see photosynthesis is showing carbon going into the canopy, and then they make sugar, and that's their eating. But then on the right side in the middle there, what we're measuring there is soil respiration. And in the diagram, it says heterotrophic respiration of carbon dioxide there. That chamber is sitting on the soil surface, and all the carbon dioxide is coming up and being trapped in that chamber. And then that blue box and white box there, that's a CO2 analyzer in a computer, and that's telling us how much CO2 is coming out. So I spend a lot of time measuring where carbon is going in trees, going in and going out, or maybe things like this. Okay, that of course is explained by the vascular cambium of a tree. The diameter growth occurs at one very slender little spot wrapped around the entire tree from tip to bottom, called the vascular cambium. And if there's a very, very stationary object there, a tree will engulf that with diameter growth over time, which is what's happening in that picture. But it really looks like that thing swallowed it up. Well, in essence, I guess it did. So speaking of this, where carbon is going and things that I measure, in the process of respiration, what does a plant create? And then we'll talk about it a little bit more. So in the process of respiration, what does a plant create? Does it create carbon dioxide? Okay. Or does it create oxygen? Plants now. Or does it create glucose, sugar? Or does it create methane, illustrated by that coming out of the rear end of the cow there? That's been making some headlines in recent days about cow flatulence. So what does a tree create in the process of respiration? And answer being revealed is carbon dioxide. Now, you know, one good thing that came out of the COVID pandemic is that I'm able to talk to you guys. Everybody uses Zoom now, other than I would have to drive there, right? In the past, we didn't ever do this. But what I miss in this is your reactions. Like I can't see like, oh, really? It's that? So I don't get to see any of that. But this one gets people a little bit. Like a lot of people say, oh, no, plants create oxygen. But oxygen's created through photosynthesis, not respiration. And then another thing that people, even students here after like freshman bio, they only learn this. Plants have photosynthesis, and like in this diagram, people have animals have respiration. Plants have respiration as well. And in plant respiration, as I show there now, carbon dioxide comes out of the plant as well. So it's not a trick question. Photosynthesis creates oxygen and glucose, but respiration gives off CO2 just like we do. Okay. So wait, plants produce sugar, but then they burn sugar like we do. Well, here's what's really going on there. okay? So going down, starting at the lower right, say, so photosynthesis, carbon dioxide goes in and carbohydrates are made, sugar is made, okay? And in that process, oxygen comes out, okay? And that's what we know, plants do that. But some of those carbohydrates at the top of the trees there, I'm showing it, respiration takes place, just like us. You know, we ate dinner, we're respiring, and it's keeping our heart, lungs, our mouth moving, right? And we need ATP for that. While plants need some of the carbohydrates burned in respiration, and they use that ATP to build stuff. If they didn't, just like us, if they didn't have respiration, there would just be a pile of sugar on the ground. So they take some of the sugar and burn it and use that ATP energy made in that process to then assemble the other sugar into everything you see that's a tree. They're making leaves, they're making the trunk, they're making the roots, everything in that diagram. Now, the problem becomes if they make 100 units of sugar, we won't get into like, we'll just say 100 units. They can't burn 100 units in respiration, or they've got nothing left to build their tree trunk with or get taller. And they've got to get taller every year, or suddenly they're not going to get light. Their neighbor's going to get the light. And then they're going to be photosynthesizing less. And then the trees get into a problem where they slip below the canopy, and you come back in 10 years and that tree will be gone. Now, people are different. When we finally reach maturity, and at our age, we do want to burn exactly what we eat every day to maintain our weight constant. Trees have to always have a little left over to build with. And sometimes we have a little left over to build with, but oftentimes we're fighting and struggling with that. So plants have respiration as well, and CO2 comes out in that. But they're certainly more famous for having photosynthesis. So our next quiz question is, who discovered photosynthesis? Now, no one person did it, but in this answer here, it's the person that's kind of given credit for really like largely first identifying photosynthesis in plants. But many times in the science world, there's a bunch of different teams everywhere working on these things, and they're talking at conferences and everybody's sharing information. But you know, sometimes one person gets the credit. So this is kind of who got the credit for discovering photosynthesis. So was it Robert Boyle? Yeah, that's the best picture I could find of him on the internet back in the Whig days there. Was it James Watson? A little bit more contemporary. Did he discover photosynthesis? And you might recognize some of these names, like Boyle's law. It's a gas law that Robert Boyle discovered. Is it Joseph Priestley? Or is it Charles Darwin? Which I bet everybody recognizes that name. And the funny thing, every picture of him on the internet, he's kind of got his angry eyes in. There's no good picture of him like smiling. He's always looking kind of grim in all his internet pictures. So who do you think that was? Give your answer there. And we're going to have the reveal here in 3, 2, 1. It is Joseph Priestley discovered photosynthesis. And this might jog your memory a little bit. What he did was, it was a little gruesome. We wouldn't even get permission to do this nowadays, probably. He put a mouse in a bell jar, and of course, there on the left, the mouse dies. Put a plant in a bell jar, and over time, the plant dies. But when you put the plant and the rat in the bell jar together, he found they both lived happily ever after, or at least the length of his experiment. Because as the rat or the mouse breathed out carbon dioxide, the plant took up the carbon dioxide in photosynthesis, and the plant gave out oxygen. And then so what he said was, that plants were capable of fixing bad air. Like the bad air killed the rat. They still didn't know all the elements in the air and everything, but he knew like plants were doing something magical and always repairing the air. Now, what he doesn't tell you there, this is kind of why people think, oh, plants do photosynthesis, animals do respiration. If you took the plant and the rat, the bell jar on the right, and put that in the dark, the rat dies even faster. Because in the dark, the plant's only doing respiration, and so is the rat or the mouse, and it will die even faster because the plant is consuming oxygen in the dark in its respiration. And it's respiring so it can take sugar and build things with the sugar molecules. So that's the one thing that's kind of left out a little bit, that plant is sort of secretly also doing respiration. Okay, now back to the forests of Virginia, now that we know, so how do plants eat and respire, just like all animals.
Dr. Seiler,
Yep.
who discovered respiration and how does a plant get its ATP?
I'd have to look up who discovered respiration, but how they get their ATP is the same way we get ours. Sugar is burned up in the mitochondria. Like many times they say the mitochondria are the furnace of the cells making energy, but a furnace is, of course, making heat energy. In plants and animals, the mitochondria are making ATP by, and the big loser there is glucose. It's burned up, and the CO2 is breathed out by us, and what's left is ATP to keep our muscles going.
Okay.
And in the case of the plants, they assemble the leftover sugar they got and build things with it, the things that we see.
Okay, thank you.
So we know how many trees are in the state of Virginia. We know like the percent hardwood and softwood. But now let's really drill in here. What's the most dominant tree species? And everybody's going to have some idea here by volume. Okay, so it's not just how many, but like you could have a whole lot of a tree, but they're all very, very little. Or you could have fewer, but they're giant trees. So this is volume, okay? What's the top species in forest land in Virginia? And this again comes from those inventories that they do. So our choices are red maple, and there's pictures of them all that might jog your memory like, oh, I know that. I see a lot of those. Red maple, Acer rubrum. Or is it loblolly pine? That's a plantation of loblolly pine there. They're super, super straight, and they're all very uniform looking because that happens to be, surprise, a clonal plantation of loblolly pine. Every one of those trees are genetically identical, and they're superior growing trees, which is why they get planted. That's a tree farm, in other words. Is it Virginia pine? And we certainly have a lot of that. It's Pinus virginiana. It's named after Virginia. Or is it yellow poplar? Now I'm going to tell you, all of these are certainly in the running. I don't have any weird, obscure ones here. They're all, if you walk into the woods, I always joke with students, you could drive anywhere and park, and when you get out, you can throw a rock to a red maple. Because red maple's kind of unique. It grows on dry mountaintops, and it grows down in swamps and everything in between. But you got your answers. Pick an A, B, C, or D. It isn't the winner. Red maple is not. It's yellow poplar is the most abundant tree by volume. And here's numbers from our census report for the state. These are state of Virginia, top 10 trees. So you'll see some other ones you probably recognize there. Yellow poplar's got 5,018 million cubic feet, okay? Cubic block of wood. There is a lot of loblolly pine. There's a couple oak species. There's your red maple, and there's Virginia pine. And that was, yeah, those are all of them that we had choices of. So yellow poplar, and that, well, I don't have the leaf there. Oh, no, there it is, yeah. That's got that really iconic leaf shape. Very, very unique to the Appalachians. Like if someone was starting an Appalachian club, that you might want like a yellow poplar leaf on your logo. It's very, very iconic for the eastern forests of the United States, and there's a lot of that. Now, here's something that you guys can help with. All hickory, if you summed up, notice there's no one single hickory in that top 10 list. But the predominant forest type in Virginia, and you may have heard this term. This again, if we were there and I could see your faces, you could be nodding your heads or something. The predominant forest group in Virginia is called oak hickory. And you can find maps of the forest types of the US that there'll be this sliver in the eastern Appalachians called the oak hickory. But there's no good reason to be calling it that. Like back here, the top 10, there's not a single hickory. And if we summed up what I mean by all hickory, if you summed up every species of hickory, there's only 1,527, which would still put it at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at number 6. Okay. But we call our forest oak hickory, and master naturalists, we could tell people we shouldn't call it that. What we probably should be calling it is simply mixed oak poplar, because look at all the oak species in the top 10: chestnut oak, white oak, northern red oak, scarlet oak, and black oak. If you summed up oak species, they'd be at the top if you lumped them all together. So when you hear people say that, you can maybe say, well, you know, honestly, we should just call it poplar oak. And here's there's two scientific papers. That's literally them laying there, but here's just 2 quotes there. No real evidence was found for a regional oak hickory forest, yet there's all kind of USDA maps. Like somebody once called it that, and it's just stuck. And then the other paper, there seems to be little quantitative basis for including hickory in the name of the prevailing hardwood forest association of the Virginia Piedmont. So that's a paper centered on Virginia. Yet here we keep calling it the oak hickory. So you guys as a group, and I tell all the groups this, don't be rude about it. Just say, you know, there's not a real good reason to be including hickory into any of these names. Not to say there aren't any, but you saw the data there. They don't even make it in the top 10 if you lump them all together. There's about, there's 4 or 5 hickory species in Virginia. Now here, what's the top species dominant by number of stems? Okay, so this is literally how many per acre. So now you can have a whole lots of little ones. And I don't have a quiz here, but just to show you real quick, that's when red maple, because a lot of people, you may have put red maple as an answer. It has the highest number of stems. In this case, it's thousands of trees. And it's way above, it's a good bit above even number 2, loblolly pine, which we've got a lot of loblolly pine, primarily because that's our big tree farm species. That's making our decking and all our paper and paper products, all our cereal boxes, that's grown in loblolly pine tree farms. And then there, look how far yellow poplar drops down. So there's yellow poplar just gets a lot bigger than red maple does. And that Virginia pine is still in there. We got our white oak and our chestnut oak in there. And what's interesting, our state tree shows up at number 10, flowering dogwood. But they're certainly really, really little. They're not going to be a top tree by volume at all. But it's nice that it makes it into the top 10 by stem, because after all, that's our state tree and state flower. I was once at a conference, and there's a lot of concern about red maple. And this is Dr. Jim Vose, who's very high up in the Forest Service. And he said at this conference, if this keeps going, the only thing left is gonna be red maple, cockroaches, and rats are gonna be all that remain. And when he said that, I know him, and I wrote it down and said, I'm gonna be using this quote at some time, Jim. And here I'm using it on him. A lot of the eastern forests are getting worried about red maple, how it's taking over. And we could be another whole talk about that, but largely it's because we aren't having the number of fires that we used to have in the past. We're starting to wise up, and we're doing a lot of what's called prescribed burning, but a lot of the forests, honestly, in the whole world, we started running out and putting every fire out about 50 years ago with Smokey Bear campaigns in the US. Very, very successful public relation campaign. And a lot of forests, including those in the east, need to have periodic burns. And that's what most forest ecologists believe why red maple is becoming so dominant. And it's a concern because it's when you have red maple, you have fewer oak species, and oaks are used for a lot more forest products, not the least of which are wine and whiskey barrels. And there's literally a concern right now that we're going to run out of oak for barrel making. That might change in the future, but right now that's a booming industry because of all the little micro distilleries, and they all need the species white oak to put their liquors in.
Dr. Seiler, there's a question. If someone asked you what one native tree should I plant, what would it be?
Oh boy, that's okay. I would probably plant a white oak, but the real answer is, I hate to do this, but it's complicated. You have to know, like, is it a heavy soil or a well-drained soil? But if we had, like, let's just say an average soil, I'm a little partial to white oaks because they're going to live 300, 400, 500 years. Now, that's not my favorite tree. People always say, like, what's my favorite tree? And that's a butternut, also known as white walnut. But that's a really particular tree. It would largely die in a lot of areas if you tried that. But you honestly can't go wrong with a white oak. But then I have to ask, like, do you want it to grow fast? Well, that's not going to be white oak. So it kind of depends what you want, but that would be a good native one to plant. And so would yellow poplar. Yellow poplar grows very fast and is a good shade tree as well. That's a lot you could discuss about there with that one. So now, how do trees drink? And what we're talking about there, I didn't make any. You find these things on the internet. So literally, I was like, oh wow, that's literally trying to talk about how a tree drinks up water out of the soil. And it is a very, very fascinating subject. In fact, some years I teach an entire semester class to graduate students on what's called plant water relations, and that the whole semester is on how plants get water. And so there's a lot to it, but there's a couple key things I think you can take away here tonight about water uptake into tall trees. Now, just a little background first, okay? So whatever the theory is, and when we get to the end of this, it's kind of interesting how science works. The explanation that we've got is still labeled as a theory. And it gets challenged every now and again. And the most recent one was about 15 years ago that another person proposed, like, I think we may have been wrong. But then that was kind of beat back by other researchers who did tests of his theory. So this what we're going to have here is what our best understanding is as to how trees take up water. But for whatever the theory is, it's got to hold up to explain uptake into the tallest trees. Okay, like it's one thing to explain water uptake into, say, a tomato plant, or, well, let's use a tree, flowering dogwood, which is not very, very tall. But how does it get up into very, very, very tall trees? So we're first going to start with another question. So what are the 3 tallest tree species in the world? This is kind of a fun one. Now, this is in the whole world, okay, not North America. Okay. And the tallest is how they're listed 1, 2, 3 it's the tallest, then number 2, and then number 3 in the world. So the tallest is the first one. So is it coast redwood, giant sequoia, and Sitka spruce? Or are the tallest coast redwood again, Douglas fir, or Australian mountain ash? These are that's actually a eucalyptus. None of these are made up names. These trees really exist. So it's a eucalyptus that grows in Australia. Or is it Douglas fir first, coast redwood, and Tasmanian blue gum, which sounds like I'm making that one up, but that's also a eucalyptus tree. Or is it coast redwood, giant sequoia? Well, that's the same as A. And third, Douglas fir. Okay, so what do you think? And the big reveal coming up is it's coast redwood, Douglas fir, and Australia mountain ash. And here they are. The coast redwood is currently the champ, is at 379.46 feet. And I always question that the 4.6, like the instruments we use, it probably should say 379.5, but they actually had it listed at 100th of a foot there. And I don't think the instruments can really do that, but 379. Coast Douglas fir, and there's pictures of those species there. Those aren't all the those aren't the champ trees. Okay. They are 327.3 feet, and then Australian mountain ash at 327 feet. And I saw something on the internet where the Australian mountain ash switched with the coast Douglas fir, because they're neck and neck, as you see there. So at least the most recent stuff, and I didn't change the slide, they're still the same three, but the Australian mountain ash jumped ahead of the coast Douglas fir, apparently according to the internet. So that's really tall. So how do we get water up there? Now, before we do that, I know a lot of you are probably thinking, wait a minute, what about giant sequoia? That wasn't on the list anywhere, okay? And that's me in front of General Sherman, which is the biggest giant sequoia. They're the largest in terms of volume, but they're not as tall as any of those other three. The General Sherman tree is only 275 feet tall, so it doesn't even crack 300. But the thing is almost 33 feet in diameter at the base. Now, to put that in perspective again, like, you throw out big numbers like that, and you're like, well, yeah, that's big. If that came down, that pretty much stomps every house. Like, you'd only see the corners sticking out. In some homes, you wouldn't see anything. So an entire house would fit under a 33-foot, not circumference, diameter tree. The first branch on General Sherman, okay, a branch is like 150 feet up, and the branch is 8 feet in diameter. So that means if you laid across it, we wouldn't see your head or your feet from the ground unless you're over 8 feet tall. So like a big giant white oak, like the white oaks here in our old growth forest called Stadium Woods, like the biggest one's 4 feet in diameter. So that's a little branch on a sequoia. So they're massive organisms. If you haven't ever seen them, that's something for sure to be on a bucket list. I got to tell you, because when you see them, they look like something out of the Lord of the Rings. They look like they get up and start walking around. These things, they're just unbelievable. To me, they're more impressive than the redwoods, which are a lot taller. But the sequoias are just massive branches and massive chunky tops on them. Really interesting looking. So that's why sequoia is not on the list, not the tallest. So back now to how do we get water up a tree? Well, here's some interesting facts that you have to think about here. So our tallest tree is almost 380 feet. So that would require to have standing water in a 380-foot pipe, and trees are just an assembly of a whole bunch of tiny little pipes. That would require 165 pounds per square inch. at the bottom or the base of the tree. Now, household water pressures are like 35, 40, 45 PSI. Car tire pressures like 30, 35 PSI. 165 is a really high pressure, like that's dangerous high. So if the first lumberjack that came along and stuck a tree like in a redwood, water would come out. If it was under pressure like that, it would come out explosively. 165 PSI, it would be like a water jet squirting out of a wound. So the point of that, trees don't have that. Like when you cut a tree down, even like an oak tree, water is not spraying like a hydrant out of the stump of the tree. In fact, what we find is the exact opposite. The water in tree trunks are under negative pressures. Remember that. It's actually negative. It's called tension. So when you cut a branch off a tree or you cut a tree down, the water columns snap backwards like you snipped a rubber band. It's under tension, like pulling on a rubber band. And you know this by when you're trimming your hedges or pruning trees, you're not getting sprayed in the face by water squirting out of the wound. Sometimes in the spring, we get very low pressures and we get river birch dripping. We can collect sugar maple sap and make maple syrup. Those are all very, very high, very, very, very low pressures, but it's a positive pressure. And they only exist for very short periods of time before the leaves come out. Right as the leaves, or in the case of sugar maple, as soon as the buds crack, that pressure is gone. So there are not high pressures in trees, bottom line on what we mean there. Now, another thing people thought, just as more background as to how do we get water up? Another thing they thought, and it was very logical, okay, maybe there's living cells, like how our intestines squish our food moving along, or a pump like a heart. Maybe there's tubes that squeeze the water up to the top of a tree. But people did very, very clever experiments back then with the tools that they had. Like they took steam out into the woods with them, high pressure steam in a tank. And they steamed like the stem, the trunk of a grapevine. It's a very high, they scalded the whole thing and killed any living cell that was in there. And those papers were published and water flow didn't stop. Later, when we had microwaves, people back when they were recently challenging this theory that we're going to show you in a second, they microwave twigs, and they didn't have microwaves back when they were first studying this. They had to steam it. And what everything has found out is that living cells aren't required along the pathway. In fact, that's a close-up picture of the xylem on the left there. They're all dead, hollow straws. Okay, they're like paper, very thick-walled straws. And in fact, it's the xylem is what we know is wood. When someone says when they're working with a piece of wood, you're working with the xylem. And the pictures on the right there, the outer white portions under the bark there, that's the whole thing is xylem there, but the white part is known as the sapwood, which is where active water flows. The center darker wood is the heartwood. That's still xylem, but it's plugged up at that point. And sometimes it's plugged up with chemicals that make the heartwood really pretty, like the cherry tree on the left and the black walnut on the white. And then we use them in woodworking. So just that outer white area is the xylem, that water goes up, but it's still dead. Sometimes people think sapwood's alive. Those are dead, hollow straws. No cytoplasm, no mitochondria like we were talking about, no chloroplasts like photosynthesis. They're hollow. You can really see it in the picture on the left there. So no living cells. So that took out, no pumps are required. But then someone else did this. They took a grapevine, put it in a tub of water, cut it, and it took up water. But then they put poison in the water, and water kept going up because no living cells are required until the poison got to the leaves and it killed the grapevine leaves and water flow stopped. And so that added something interesting. The pathway doesn't have to be alive, but living leaves are required. Okay. And that brings us to the name of the theory. So that's the background that people discovered. And the current thinking and theory that's in every textbook that students would use is called the cohesion tension theory. And there's a lot going on in that diagram, but I can explain it kind of much simpler. At the top of the tree, water evaporates when the sun's out. The stomata open. That's the little pores on leaves where gases go in and out. Water starts exiting. One water molecule basically jumps out of the airplane, out of the stomata. Well, water molecules really like each other. They are all clinging together, and they're known as being very cohesive. That's why the word cohesion is in this theory. So when one water molecule exits the leaves, and they exit it because it evaporates, it pulls the next water molecule up, and it's the next one that's going to evaporate. And this is happening in millions of places in all the leaves up in the tree canopy. These water molecules are constantly coming out on a hot, sunny day, and it constantly drags the next one forward because they're very cohesive due to what's called hydrogen bonding. But that's not, you don't have to really remember that. You just got to remember that water molecules cling together like a chain of magnets, plus and negative ends. Like you can string a bunch of magnets together, they cling together. One breaks off, it pulls the next one up the line. So as you go down the tree there, as it's showing, the little chain of water molecules are pulled upward through the tree trunk xylem, then all the way down in the bottom there, down to the root xylem. And when one gets pulled forward along this big chain that's being pulled up, it drags the next water molecule in out of the soil water. Now, this pulling creates a stretched tension in the water columns because water is very heavy and it's hanging there, but the columns don't break because of the hydrogen bonds from one water molecule to the next. And that results, the pulling, the hanging, that results in the tension. And so when you cut a branch off a tree, water actually snaps back in both directions, back into the branch and back into the trunk. Literally like you snip a stretched rubber band. And that's the tension. And they put both those terms together. You have the cohesion tension theory. The cohesiveness allows the water molecules to hang together. And then you're pulling it up. Just like if you were pulling like a 10-pound weight upwards into a treehouse with a rope, there's tension on the rope. Snip it, it breaks. It's not being pushed up under positive pressure like plumbing in a house. It's being pulled or sucked up to the top of the tree.
Dr. Seiler, when you have a situation where compartmentalization occurs, like compartmentalization of decay due to an injury in the tree trunk, does the tree compensate for that, for the loss of that water conduction ability by transferring that work to some other column of cells?
Yeah, well, yes and no. Sometimes if like half the tree gets killed, like cooked, burned in a fire, okay, not killed. The xylem's already dead, but it's burned back, a big fire wound. If it's like half of the circle, you could have some branches die. Okay, so it's a matter of like how much. On a normal day-to-day basis, It's a really interesting question. There are water molecules columns snapping, but trees have great redundancy built into the system, that a little bit breaking here and there, there's plenty of excess. So it just depends on how much. So when there's a great big damage, like here's something that happens all the time, construction, where they didn't protect the tree adequately during construction, and a backhoe like smacks a good half of the tree, they'll sometimes lose limbs because they can't deliver water to the entire tree crown anymore. So it just depends on how much gets knocked out.
Dr. Seiler,
Uh-huh.
what happens in the winter when a deciduous tree loses its leaves?
Well, that's part of their strategy. Like the soil water will freeze, and if they didn't lose their leaves, they'd have a really hard time getting any water when the ground freezes, and so they lose their leaves. So there's very little water moving in a tree. And in fact, in very cold weather like we're having down here right now, the water actually freezes solid even in the xylem. So
Oh,
there's no water movement.
okay.
Sometimes conifers, evergreen trees, sometimes they can have problems with winter burn, it's called, where the soil water's frozen, and it's like along a house foundation, it'll occur where the bricks get warm and the needles get warmed up, but the ground's frozen. They can sometimes dry out during the winter.
Oh, yeah.
You largely see these problems in plantings out in the forest. Again, there's not warm pockets like due to the south side of a building, and there's not a lot of that. But even then, sometimes on like a weird winter, you can even get winter burn in conifers in the forest. It doesn't usually kill them. The buds are still protected, but you can get brown needles. Yeah. So the cohesion tension theory is the way they believe it gets up into the tree. And really, it's really kind of literally unbelievable. You know, somebody right away said, okay, if it's due to being so cohesive, very clever study again. A really very simple way to break the cohesiveness of water molecules, and you do it every day, is soap. Soap's known as a wetting agent. It causes the water hydrogen bonds to collapse and water gets flatter. So soap in a bucket, you wash your car better because the water spreads out. And same with on our bodies. So they said, okay, if this is true, this should be a problem with taking up soapy water. So somebody said, well, let's see if like a grapevine or this cut tree can take up soapy water. And what they found is that the whole thing falls apart. It can't. All the water columns snap apart. Believe it or not, there's even been people that have sat outside with very sophisticated acoustic microphones hooked up to corn plants, and they can, on hot, dry days in a cornfield, they can hear the water columns snapping. We can't hear them with our ears, but you hear them snap like cutting a rubber band. And the clicking sounds are very high when the soil's dry and it's a hot, sunny day. And then when it rains and the soil's very wet, very few clicking sounds are heard because the tension is relieved when the soil gets really wet. So a lot of stuff supports this, but it is still labeled a theory, not like a law.
There's a question before you move on. There's a question that says, is there anything we can learn from how ancient sequoias and redwoods ingest water to apply to our Northern Virginia trees, especially during a drought such as we suffered this autumn?
Well, they do believe that redwoods get as tall as they do because it's been proven that they absorb water from the fog every morning. People have literally measured it going in, not out of the leaves when they're bathed in 100% humidity every morning. So they actually they're unique in that they take up water through their foliage every morning due to the fog. So I mean, you could be going out, it's not practical at all. We'll do it some in the greenhouse. You could be going out and misting your plants all the time on hot, sunny days. You're keeping the soil wet, but misting their foliage will lower the transpiration rate to near zero until all that water evaporates off the leaves. So, but that's certainly not a practical thing you could do. You could put out all these little fog generators, but there's not much we can really do practical. I think that answered the question.
I don't know, Sandy, how you doing with that answer? I
Yeah,
think so.
don't live on the West Coast.
Yeah, okay. All right, so here's something else that I've noticed over time, like with students at least, they come out of school with a interesting idea about this sometimes. So movement in the phloem is always down and movement in the xylem is always up. Now, if you don't remember, the phloem is what moves sugars around. The phloem is the first thing under the bark. Like when you don't want to do this, but when you accidentally knock bark off a tree, usually that inside wet portion of the bark, that's your phloem. Usually when the bark is knocked off, you took the phloem with it. It's very, very, very thin band right under the bark. And that's responsible for moving sugars around. So is movement in the phloem always down and movement in the xylem, which we just were talking about, that's water uptake. Is that always up? Phloem down, xylem up, true or false? This one you got a 50-50 chance on it. There's just add a little picture to it. There, that is actually showing, that's off the internet. That's showing sugar green going down, blue water going up. But that's wrong. So not everything on the internet, even like on a biological site, is correct. Movement in both tissues can go in any direction. Like in the phloem, a leaf can produce sugar, and that sugar can move out into the twig in the phloem, and then it can go up to an apple that's upstream from that leaf. Where this comes from is the roots of a tree are completely dependent on the top of the tree to deliver all its sugar needs. In a way, roots are like us. They've got to be fed. They don't have any photosynthesis. They're down in the dark. And they have to get sugar from the top. So a lot of times people are taught phloem is down. But certain times of the year, like when there's like fruit trees are the best example. Those are just bags of sugar, an apple or an orange, and many times it's moving upward into the orange. And xylem is sometimes down. Here's the paper, one of them I talked about. It's been proven with redwood trees. There's the quote, xylem sap transport reversed direction during heavy fog with instantaneous flow rates in the direction of the soil, peaking at approximately 5 to 7% of the maximum transpiration rate. So it's not as much going down, but significant amounts are believed to go into redwoods in heavy fog events, which occur almost on a daily basis. So both can go either direction, but largely water goes up to the leaves, and most, I don't know if you can even say most, a lot of sugar goes down to the roots. They've got to be fed, or they're not going to be happy. In fact, I don't know if girdling a tree, sometimes like an unwanted tree in the forest, like an invasive, a really easy way to kill them. You don't have to cut them all the way down, is you just girdle the tree. You like peel a ring of bark off of an ailanthus tree. You severed the sugar highway to the roots, and they slowly starve to death and the tree dies. So you can just peel off the phloem, and that'll cause the roots to die. Now let's go talk about tree talk a little bit here. This gets kind of interesting in its own way. So what communication is? It's activity by one organism that changes or has the potential to change the behavior of other organisms. So it's not necessarily like talking. Okay, so we're just talking is there any communication from tree to tree? So a transfer of information from one organism to another, chemical, electrical, speaking, right? We largely think of that. Animals make all kinds of noises that communicate to one another. So that's communication. Or I guess they could just use scary faces. Okay, so there's some goofy tree. I really particularly like the second from the left there with the English ivy coming out like it's throwing up. That one really, and it has like teeth in the top of its mouth too. Several of them have little teeth in them. But what really goes on there? So it has been found that some trees communicate with each other. There's papers published where willow trees attacked by webworms or caterpillars, they emit, when the leaves are being chewed on, chemical signals come out in the air, and whoopsie, that like switched on its own, or the waving of my hands. I'm not sure what did that. That emit a chemical that alerts nearby willows of the danger. And the unattacked neighboring trees respond by pumping more tannic acid into their leaves, which make it more difficult for insects to digest the leaves. So they hear from their neighbors that are under attack, and they start producing defense chemicals. And that's just the paper published that showed that, and that alders as well do that. And then here's another one where it was sagebrush and a wild tobacco that they communicated to one another, defense chemicals. And they found, and it makes sense that in this case, it only traveled about a meter, and even like if it's a windy day, it'll even be less. So, like when many of these things we can't smell, like the willow one, you really couldn't smell, but the chemicals go into the stomata of the other leaves. But something like you crush up conifer needles and sagebrush, you can kind of smell it actually. And if you were to like go up to a sagebrush and start crushing it, it could signal the other one that, oh, something's going on bad, and it might close its stomata and clamp up and produce biochemical defense signals. Like they don't know it's a person crushing the needles. They think it's like a caterpillar chewing on the foliage. So there have been cases of that, of information being transferred. Root grafting is another way where this occurs in the forest too. It certainly occurs in urban situation in densely planted like sidewalk areas where roots of one tree connect to the roots of another tree, and they literally graft together like in those pictures there. And so water and sugar moving in different directions could come up and move into the other tree. It's not always a positive thing. Like this is a major way that Dutch elm disease spreads. So that's kind of like being it's certainly communication, but it's kind of being like a bad neighbor. That's like when you're stuck in a car with someone who has a cold, and then everyone gets the cold because you're driving in a car, and you're kind of doomed in that sort of situation. And elm trees, again, planted in tight city situations, almost all the roots get fused. And so one tree gets Dutch elm disease. And those are root grafts there on the left of elms. And then on the right, there's a couple dead ones and one that's not doing too good there. And they're connected, and the fungus is in the xylem, and it'll just flow right through one root and go right up the next root. So that's kind of a very very negative transfer of information in that situation. And then you may have heard of allelopathy. That's where biological chemicals are produced in a plant that influences other plants, like their germination rate, their growth rate, survival, reproduction. And kind of a famous one is black walnut. A lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that one. It produces a chemical known as juglone. It comes in all parts. You can see there the fruit. as percentages is the highest, and the leaves have a lot. Even flower buds have some. The phloem, the outer bark and the inner bark, has a little bit. But that's kind of again, being a bad neighbor. Walnuts, the juglone inhibits the growth of other plants. So that's kind of your classic get off my lawn kind of thing. So walnuts are sort of bad neighbors. And you may have heard, like, don't put a garden under a black walnut tree. I will, kind of new information here, okay? And I don't want to get in an argument with anybody, but because you may have heard otherwise, I don't know. But my experience is it is really true, okay? But it's way overstated. Like, there's a lot of stuff that grows just fine under walnut trees. And I once, one of my daughters did a science experiment where she collected all kind of soils, one of which was under a black walnut and one was under like white oak. And her best tomato growth, she was really disappointed, but I was like, this is fascinating, Sarah. The best tomato growth was in the walnut soil. So it does it, but it is a little bit overstated. Like, but it's way more subtle than a lot of textbooks will lead on. But it's a real effect. I mean, if it gives the walnut a little advantage out there in the competitive world, it can help it grow better than its neighbors do. So it's a kind of get off of my lawn sort of thing.
Dr. Seiler, there was a question about verticillium, and the question was, can it be spread this way? I think that's the root to root, or only through contaminated soil.
With the
Verticillium wilt, yeah.
was this the Dutch elm, or was this in reference to walnut?
Yeah, I think the Dutch elm, when you were talking about that and roots.
Oh yeah, it would not be contaminated soil. It's the fungus is in and contained in the xylem. It grows well in moist, dark places, and that's the xylem, and then it plugs it up. So that fungus will just spread like crazy right up the xylem of its neighbor if they're connected. But
And that would also happen with verticillium, which is a wilt that affects tomatoes.
yeah, that one might. Now, I'm not a pathologist, so I'd have to ask Dr. Fearer upstairs. I think that one can be you got to be careful with the soil on that one. The soil can spread it. But you definitely don't want to quote me on that. But I think that's right.
We have a different question too about whether an elm that's planted singly by itself would be less vulnerable to Dutch elm disease because there's no nearby roots that could pass the disease onto it.
Yes, but the root vectoring, the root grafting is not the only way, unfortunately. There's a little beetle that itself doesn't harm much, the Dutch elm beetle. And what it does is it just bores into the xylem, and then it doesn't realize this, but the fungal spores cling to its body, and then it flies to another elm and does a little chewing and basically injects the spores into the xylem, unbeknownst to the beetle. But so it's also spread by a little tiny beetle. So the answer would be yes, but it wouldn't keep it safe. It might get a little bigger before it gets hit with it, but it's likely going to get it.
Do fungi ever do good things between trees or among trees?
Very good segue, because here we go.
Okay.
So we were doing communication now. Mycorrhiza and plant gossip, okay? So mycorrhiza are a fungi that attack root systems. Those are tree roots that are entangled in fungus, okay? And what it is, though, there's a real close-up of it. You can see the fungus filaments there. They're a symbiotic relationship. They're a good relationship between the fungi and all plants. All plants all throughout the world, from tiniest plants to trees, all have mycorrhiza. It's not an exception, really. It's kind of a rule. And in this case, it's beneficial. Now, it's interesting, when the plant starts being attacked with these mycorrhizal fungi, they actually react like defensively, like it's a pathogen. They just like the fungi need to like say, calm down, I'm going to help you. But they don't initially react that way. But it ends up being a mutually beneficial thing. So a symbiosis, if you're not familiar with that word, that's a lit word that means living together. And it can be bad, like parasitic. They live together, but the one's a parasite. But in this case, it's mutualistic. Both things benefit, mutually beneficial. And what happens is after and here's like really some really strange roots. The white ones are infected with the fungus all around it. And it colonizes the root system of the host plant, okay? And before I tell you what they do, I'm going to see what you know. So here's our question 8 of 10. Mycorrhiza can help trees with all of the following except, so we know it helps, okay, but I haven't said what yet. So does it help with, and some of you know more about this than others, and I realize some of you are like, well, I don't know yet, but let's just see. Does it help with water uptake? And we covered, plants drinking. Could these mycorrhiza help with that? Could they? I just noticed this. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, not A, B, C, D. I got to fix that. Does it help capture and fix atmospheric nitrogen? You may have heard of nitrogen fixation in plants. Okay. Does it help survival and growth? Like have there been scientific studies, mycorrhizal roots, you get better survival and growth of like that little happy tree seedling right there. And is it known to help with soil phosphorus uptake? And there's a very complex representation of the phosphorus cycle with a plant right in the middle there. So which is false, basically? They don't help with which one of those? And I have a feeling a bunch of people are going to miss this. This is just based on when I'm doing these talks in person. They do not help with atmospheric nitrogen fixation. That is done by root nodules shown there in the picture. And those are generally bacteria that do that, like bean plants and pea plants, the legumes. There's trees that do this, black locust, red bud, have nodules on their root system. That alder is another one, but those are not mycorrhiza. But mycorrhiza help with water uptake, survival and better water uptake. You're generally going to get better survival and growth. And they also help with soil phosphorus uptake. All those have been found in the literature and generally results in the better survival and growth. And so basically what's going on here, the mutualism, the fungi produce a huge network of fungi that move all through the soil. It's not just wrapped around the roots. These filaments are going out all through the soil. And that's like a huge increase in the root system, basically. And they find water and they find more nutrients that are dissolved in the water. The plant provides the fungus. So the fungus gives the plant increased water nutrients. And the fungus, which can't make its own sugar, the plant provides sugar to it, the carbohydrates. And it's been found that up to 10% of the sugar that the plant's making goes to the fungus. So generally it's mutualistic, that both things benefit. If you're growing a tree in super, super rich soil, and that's very, very moist, yet it wouldn't need mycorrhiza. But that's generally not the situation in a forest soil. Some of them are not very rich in nutrients and some not very rich in water. And so the mycorrhiza are pretty essential for their normal survival and growth. Some weird little things that have happened, like when they've moved a tree halfway around the world, they found like, hey, what's going on? This thing won't even grow. And this was called radiata pine. And what they didn't bring along with it was its mycorrhizal fungi. They grew them from seeds in the new country, and the fungus wasn't there. And so they didn't have mycorrhiza. So it's not just any old fungus. They have to have the right kind that recognizes the tree and then attacks it. Then when they brought the mycorrhiza over, everything started growing normal again. But generally out there in the wild, you can't stop the tree or garden plant from getting mycorrhiza. Sometimes you'll see these things, mycorrhiza being sold in a store. You may have seen a bag of spores, like even in like big box stores. You don't need it. The spores are out in the world everywhere, and they're going to get inoculated. So generally don't buy that stuff. Just interestingly, they've been around a long, long time. They've even found mycorrhiza. Those are fossils. Like you have to look at them under the microscope, but they've literally been fossilized, and they're about as old as the very first land plants that they have found. So I'm not sure what scientists are fossil mycorrhiza explorers, but there are people that do that and are experts in that. So it's interesting to know that they've been around a long, 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 long time. So they're generally very, very good. And at first, the tree doesn't really know that. They think they're being attacked, and then everybody settles down. Now, you may have heard some things about mycorrhizal networks resulting in the wood wide web. Maybe you've heard of that word, wood wide, kind of World Wide Web, wood wide web. Say that 10 times fast. I just proved I can't. That trees are all communicating with each other through these mycorrhizal networks. Okay, and Suzanne Simard has found carbon coming down one tree and moving through the mycorrhiza, like a root graft moving to another plant. But some of you may have even read some of these books I'm going to show you. But she also started bringing in very human terms in her writing, like mother trees, and one tree's nurturing another tree, and this tree is kin to this tree. And there's the wood wide web. You'll find that term on the internet. Then another person who wrote a book, and some of you may be familiar with this, The Hidden Life of Trees. He even, Peter Wollenbin, a forester in Europe, he started using very anthropomorphic terms that forests are social beings, and like when one's cut down, the other trees mourn. And here's a quote from his book, Trees Suckle Their Children. And a lot, I would include myself in this, they've kind of taken it a bit too far. And many people have written extensive criticisms on their writing. This is an article with over 30 authors basically condemning those books as teaching a lot of falsehoods. And here's a quote from it. The origin of this concept seems to the concept of mother trees and all stem from a desire to humanize plant life, but can lead to misunderstandings and false interpretations, and may eventually harm rather than help the commendable cause of preserving forests. Like Suzanne Simard is even talking about, we need to harvest forests in a different way, because if you cut the mother tree, the children of that tree will die. And there's just really zero evidence of that at all. They are connected like root grafts connect trees, but when people have studied like how much carbon they're really sharing, it's an insignificant amount. So if you're a fan of that, that's fine. I again, a lot of people get really emotional about this, but it's not. They've gone a bit too far. I'll just leave it at that. Okay, so they're not really communicating any more than they're connected with root grafting. It's like giant root grafting, the network of mycorrhiza underneath ground there. So now, speaking about bad neighbors and other things, we before we get out of the forests of Virginia, we got to talk about invasive plants because there is a really big invasion going on. There's kudzu and English ivy in those two pictures. But what I'm asking here is, again, this is based on the real data, that inventory data. What's the most abundant, and in this case, most occurring? So it could be a little plant, but it showed up in more forest plots than any other invasive plant in Virginia. And you'll recognize all these, but only one is the winner. So is it Oriental bittersweet, which is a very, very nasty vine that climbs up trees like snakes? They coil up the tree, and they can get as big around as your arm, and they cause a lot of damage. Oriental bittersweet. Japanese honeysuckle, there's one coiling up the tree, kind of the same thing that the Oriental bittersweet does. But that's the famous one that you pull the flower off and suckle the nectar. There's a bumblebee very happy at the Japanese honeysuckle. As a young teen in the 60s, they were giving out free Japanese honeysuckle to plant on strip mines, and I participated in doing that. And it was very good at covering the ground, but it didn't stay put and escaped, and it's an invasive plant now. Multiflora rose, that's a fun one. That's one, like if you accidentally throw your frisbee or ball into a thicket, you're probably going to just leave it there because that's got some of the nastiest hooked thorns of anything out in the forest. It is quite a pretty rose. It was used as a climbing rose in gardens and was used in highly eroded areas because that picture there, that's like 100% multiflora rose that the student's standing in. He's probably entangled in it, actually. And then you probably know kudzu. There's a kudzu sculpture completely smothered over the tree. Kudzu's got a lot of good benefit. Like you can look up what you can do with a kudzu. You can eat almost every part of it. Animals love it, but boy, it grows like crazy and smothers things. So which one do you think is the most occurring invasive woody plant in Virginia? Answer is Japanese honeysuckle, and that kind of gets people too. That occurred in almost 30% of these secret plots that they go back and measure. 30% of them had at least a single Japanese honeysuckle in them or more. It was the most abundant. Next closest was the multiflora rose. In the publication, they just called it non-native roses. Mostly it's multiflora rose, but it drops down to not even around 8%. So not even close. And then tree of heaven, which is one that we know, oh boy, that tree of heaven, we got to get rid of. It was only in 4.3% of forested plots, but it's the most commonly occurring tree, invasive tree in the state of Virginia at the last census. Calorie pear is probably going to pass it up the next time we have our inventory, I bet. But that's where it was at our last one. I got to mention some notable absences. And so the Oriental bittersweet, which was possibly one of the answers there, it was not in the top 15 even, but I think it's going to be. It is really, really bad. Okay, it is a very bad invasive. And then autumn olive, there's just a sea of autumn olive. With one about dead center in the field, there's one little dark green pyramid there. That's eastern red cedar. That's what's supposed to be there in old field succession. But what's there is autumn olive, and those lighter green rounder trees, that's unfortunately calorie pear. So that whole field where it should be eastern red cedar, old field succession taking place, is just choked with autumn olive and a few calorie pears. But the calorie pears aren't even giving the autumn olive a run for its money. So it was number 8, so it was in the top 10. But I have a feeling that, I don't know, that might be at an equilibrium. I don't know if it's going to go up. I think the Oriental bittersweet's going to climb up into the top 10 the next time. So we'll see if I'm right. I'll be running as soon as it comes out. I don't know when we're due for our next one. I'll bet it's going to be there. Some other absences is English ivy. That's English ivy climbing up a tree there. It used to be planted as a ground vine, but it didn't stay put, and it goes up and puts roots deep into the bark of the tree. And that wasn't in the top 15, and it may get there. And if things weren't bad enough, poison ivy's increasing. That's not an invasive plant, but it's a vine. Generally, what's going on everywhere in the world, vine species are increasing due to increasing carbon dioxide, not warming or drying, just literally the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The vines respond because they normally were on the ground, and where there's lower carbon dioxide because it's already been filtered through the trees, which scrubbed it out like we talked about. And so there's lower CO2 down where the vines are at. So they're more limited. And when CO2 increases, they jump. And there's a publication that says our findings indicate that under future levels of atmospheric CO2, poison ivy may grow larger and become more noxious than it is today. And that picture there, that's actually, I didn't have I should have knocked on the person's door, but I didn't know them. I was just walking on a sidewalk, and that's a poison ivy hedge. They literally pruned it. I don't, maybe they're immune to it, but they literally had a poison ivy hedge in front of their house. And I was like, wow, I got to get a picture of this. And that's a big poison ivy vine going up a tree there. So vines everywhere in the world are kind of increasing. And that's probably why English ivy and the Oriental bittersweet are going like crazy. So we're going to finish with one last topic, and we'll wrap it up for the night. You might have seen the bumper sticker, "If God isn't a Hokie, why do the leaves turn orange and maroon?" Well, I modified it. I'm sorry, God isn't a Hokie. But why do the leaves turn orange and maroon in the fall? So let's finish with that. We're past fall color, but we had a pretty nice fall season this year. And there's just some, if you haven't been to the campus in a long time, those are some nice pictures of fall color here. That's Stadium Woods there in the upper right. But before I tell you what goes on there, what's the main signal, environmental signal, for leaves to change color? Okay, what causes it? Is it cold nights? Or is it low humidity? As we go into the winter, in summer we have high humidity, winter, already my fingers are starting to crack and split. And we have our humidifier running in the house. Is that the signal? And then the leaves, are getting low humidity, higher transpiration, and they start drying out and falling off. Is it shorter days? Okay. And we're getting close to our shortest day of the year here. Or is it our first hard frost? The trees are out there, and it gets cold, and then you get that night where, oh, there it goes. Like just about 2 weeks ago, I finally lost my last impatiens. They were in a window box under the porch next to the window, and they were going so long, and then we just got a really bad frost, and they were all totally smashed in the morning. But they lasted into November. So what do you think it is? Which one is it? Answer is shorter days. That is the main signal. And that's a good signal, because when we get a warmer fall or a colder fall, whatever is occurring, if it was temperatures, trees would be delayed, and then they'd all get hit with a cold snap and get damaged. All these other things are just highly variable, but the day length is the same every date, every year. So no matter what the temperatures are doing or a hard freeze, they're gonna go dormant. So one thing you can relax about, I get asked by the press all the time about this, and then sometimes they don't want to talk to me because they want to know like how global warming is going to ruin fall color. And the answer is it's not, because it's short days that trigger it. Like this fall, we were growing a whole bunch of different oak species in the greenhouse, and we just leave the temperature high in the greenhouse, but we don't put lights on them. And the trees turn color just like outside, even though they're in a hothouse, and they drop their leaves every year. So our oaks, the white oaks turned maroon and fell off, and bur oaks turned yellow, and then the leaves fell off. Other species, if you don't put them, I had mountain ash out there, the leaves turned yellow and fell off because they're being signaled by the short day length. And so that's a really safe signal, because they don't get hit by an early frost, late frost, warm, extra warm fall, and then they get damaged. So short days is the answer for that. Now, what goes on? Well, as soon as the days start getting short, the first thing they do is they start forming a resting dormant bud. And that protects what's called the apical meristem, where all your height growth comes from. So in every bud right now, they're not really exciting to look at, but in all the buds out there in the forest, all your growth for next year is packed into that tiny little bud. And then it's all going to come out like a telescope, just going, it's going to just expand and come out of that bud, but it's all packed in there waiting to expand in the springtime. And those dormant buds protect from the harsh cold winds and the low humidity in the winter. Without the buds, the apical meristems, as they're called, would dry out in like an hour, or probably even less than that, and be killed. So the bud's really important to get them through the winter. Then with the short days, so that the trees don't get killed in the winter when the water in the soil freezes, they start to upsize. And the first thing that happens is the chlorophyll, the green pigment, it breaks down. And that reveals the yellow and the orange pigments that are called carotenoids. Think of a carrot being orange. It's interesting because the carotenoids, they're always there. All summer they're there, but the chlorophyll completely swamps it out. And so in the short days, the chlorophyll breaks down. And what the trees are smart. What they're doing, all the nitrogen and carbon and magnesium, all the stuff that's in the chlorophyll molecule, the trees reabsorb it and pull it back in to use next year before the leaves fall off. So there's not much nutrition in a brown leaf on the forest floor because the plant has reabsorbed it all as the chlorophyll breaks down. So what in the summer, what it looks like, here's the situation. If you had a paint palette, like think Bob Ross, there's like one drop of yellow and one drop of orange on the palette, and then squeeze the whole tube of green onto that palette and then mix it up. You're going to see solid green. You're not even going to know, you wouldn't even notice the yellow drop or the orange drop, but it's still there. It's still in the paint. You didn't destroy it. And then if preferentially you could then break down the green paint pigment, what would be revealed is a yellow-orange color because you put a drop of yellow and a drop of orange. It was still there, all spread out on the palette, but it's smothered by the green. So the green breaks down and you start seeing yellow and oranges. And then the reds, that's a really interesting thing. Those form in the fall. Those are called anthocyanins. They're not there in the summertime. And they largely develop, we'll say it this way, they develop well with bright days and high soil moisture and nights that are cool. But they need bright light. And in fact, if you take a leaf that's of a tree that's going to turn red, but you cover up the leaf, it won't turn red. It needs sunshine to turn red. So if we have kind of a gloomy fall, or it's dry in the fall, the yellow and the oranges are still going to be there because they were always there. but the reds might form a little less. And so that's why when it's a kind of mostly dry conditions in the fall, reds might not be popping as well as in some other years. But your yellow and your oranges are always really pretty good, no matter what happens. And then there's other colors. Your tannins bring out kind of a yellow, brown, gold color. Tannic acid, that's the same color, that's the same chemical that makes your tea brown. It's closer to brown than yellow, but those are black oak leaves there with tannic acid in them. And that gives you your yellow browns. And then, of course, what we've got is blend that all up and you get all the beauty of the color that we see out there every fall. So that's why the leaves turn orange and maroon in the fall. And that's also why most years, here's what I always tell people, and I get called, I field all the questions every year. I get inundated. How's the fall going to be? How's the fall going to be? And I want to say, just like last year, but it does vary a little bit. The reds can get muted in a dry year. Day length is the main signal, but if it stays abnormally warm or it gets cold, it can move like a week up or a week late. Okay, so here in Blacksburg, it's always the last week in October, but it could go up 1 week or move into November by 1 week, but it never really moves any more than that because the day length is the main signal, and that's always the same every year. Largely bad fall years, when people say like, oh, 2020 whatever was not good, it's when the weekend of the peak had bad weather and people just didn't get out and look at the foliage. And if it was windy, it can knock it down. It'll end it sooner. And that's kind of why the colors, a certain year will get known as a bad year. I always tell people, we don't have bad years. We have good, better, and best years. So like the worst year of fall color is still really good, but we get better and best, and every now and then we get like the perfect fall where soil moisture is nice and high. Of course, day length never changes. We get cool nights. It's clear, sunny days, and our reds are out and really popping well. And I'll just end with this, and then if you want to hang around and ask some questions, you mentioned it at the beginning, but I'll just mention it again here. If you're interested in tree identification, you can get the Virginia Tech Tree Identification app. It's for Android or iPhone, and it is free. Not many of them are free, and it's a shameless plug here. It's a very, very good app. It is an infinite number of tree books in your hand at any time. You can see on the picture there, it says Woody Plants of Blacksburg. You can enter the location where you're going. See the middle button says obtain new location. So if you know you're going to Anchorage, Alaska, you can wait till you get to Anchorage and it'll find that you're in Anchorage and it'll change to Woody Plants of Anchorage. Or you can ahead of time type in Anchorage, Alaska. You can still be in Virginia and type in Anchorage and it'll turn into Woody Plants of Anchorage. So literally it can become the trees of anywhere you're at. Tucson, San Francisco, Pittsburgh, any place in North America. So it's 1 million or more books all in one hand. And then it has an Ask Dr. Dendro button. It's not artificial intelligence. It's my intelligence. That might be questionable at times if you ask the students. But if you send a question to Dr. Dendro, I answer them personally. And people send me tree pictures. And I most times can identify it. Every now and then someone takes a picture from their kitchen window and the tree's 100 yards away. And I have to say, I can't really tell you what that is from that far away, but I'll answer all the emails that come in from that. So if you're into this kind of thing, you can go ahead and download that, and then that ends for the night.
Well, that was absolutely fabulous. I'm sure there's a million questions, and I know I could, for one, could listen to another couple of hours of that. But I know that we certainly have had some challenges in Northern Virginia with some of our trees. For instance, there was an oak decline problem some years ago, and I'm sure you heard about that, but we lost a lot of 60 to 70-year-old oak trees, particularly oak trees, in the Alexandria, particularly the northern Alexandria area.
Yeah, yeah, it's, you know, and particularly in urban areas too. Trees have a tough life, like street and shade trees. It's their lifespans are like nowhere near what they are in the natural environment. And it's just, and so then every pest and every disease, it's like when you're not taking care of yourself. And they literally in urban environments have a hard time taking care of themselves. The harsh impacted soil and limited amounts of soil, limited amounts of water, pollutants washing off the street, you know, your salt and all, you know, a million things.
Do you have any statistics on the average lifespan of an urban street tree?
Yeah, I do actually. The numbers will vary. It's anywhere from like 7 years to 15. Like once they get past that, see a whole, like the first year, like when they do a new planting, oh golly, a lot are dead in 1 year. That's why the number's so low. So once they get past that, like 7 to 15, then they can go to, you know, 60, 70 year. And it also depends, like in a good front yard, they can live a long time. But when they're in between, you know, the sidewalk and the trees, boy, they're just a big giant tree in a tiny pot. And it's pretty tough. But it's a shockingly low number because of the high mortality the first couple of years when they're little. Vandalism occurs when they're little, you know. Yeah, like even here on campus after a football game and heavy drinking, people just snap trees. They do weird things. Like, why did they just snap a tree off? And it's like, what are you doing? But they're, you know,
Right.
they're just
There's,
vandalizing.
there's a question here about V-Tree.
Yeah.
Is it a collaboration with other land-grant universities?
Nope, it's just us. And there is literally I'm just look on my phone real fast here. There's like 1,100 trees right now. Let's see, 1,105 species of trees are in the app. There it is. Dr. Ed Jensen. We built it here. A colleague of mine, he's retired, Dr. Ed Jensen. He's from Oregon State. He provided a lot of pictures and wrote some of the text for the Western trees. So yeah, it is. But it's actually a really fun and interesting story. A retired computer programmer in Tennessee who used our online material contacted me one Christmas holiday saying, would you like to build an app? I'd be happy to do it. And I'm really into this. And he did. And the rest of the story is that's the app that's there now, working with him, in collaboration with him. So he did the programming on it, and all the text and the photographs are all ours and Dr. Jensen's.
We have an interesting question about fall color. The plant named Fothergilla. Are you familiar with Fothergilla?
Uh-huh.
The question was, does the lack of daylight explain why the sunny side of a Fothergilla turns red and the shady side of the same shrub will turn orange yellow?
Yeah, that's the sunny side is the side that turns the red. See, it's the red develops in bright sunshine. I wish I had I need to put this in the talk now. I'm thinking about it. If you go into like a tree that's red and stick your head like up inside of it, normally we just see the outside driving by or hiking. If you get up into the canopy of the tree, it'll be the red will be gone. And sometimes you have one leaf laying over another leaf. And you pull it aside, there's no red underneath there. So quite literally, if you put little stickers on a tree that can turn red, not all trees can even turn red. Some turn yellow, some turn orange, and everything in between. But a tree that's capable of doing the red coloring, if you put little moon stickers or stars on a tree leaf and you peeled them off, there'd be no red in that spot. You'd have these interesting little shapes on it. So you're literally observing what I'm talking about. And
Cool.
yeah, the sunny side versus the shady side.
Could you elaborate a little bit more about the flow of water in the springtime? We
Yeah.
teach here about not pruning things like walnut and sugar and maples and river birches, because spring pruning, at least dormant season pruning, tends to cause a prolific sap flow
Yeah.
from the cut edges. Is that related to that water flow?
Well, yeah, that's the phenomena of what's called root pressure. What the tree is doing is it can generate they kind of drip. It's pretty, like you'd be really disappointed if that was your water fountain. It's only like 1 psi that they're capable of producing. But what the plant is doing is it's repairing broken xylem elements where the water snapped over the winter. It pushes water into the unfilled xylem. When I don't know if you've noticed, when you make ice cubes, gas comes out of solution and you get bubbles in your ice. So when the xylem freezes in the winter, you get a bubble. And when the ice thaws, that xylem element gets full of air. And then in the spring, what they're doing before the leaves get fully formed, they're refilling those broken xylem elements. Well, the xylem's not broken, the water column's broken. And it pushes water into them and fills them all back up. And then once heavy transpiration starts, that tension develops and that's all gone. It's only a spring phenomena and always a very, very low pressure amount.
There's also a question here about leaf abscission. Why does a leaf fall from a tree in fall? Some trees hold their leaves longer than others. Some trees start dropping leaves even when the leaves are green. Is it determinant tree species or moisture level or some other mystic factor?
Both. So there's as you're hinting at, different tree species, there's genetic differences. Okay. And that some well, sadly, Callery pear, they still have their leaves on down here in Blacksburg. They're really beautiful red, and they turn late when other things in your garden might be gone, which is why they got planted. One of the reasons, and well as their flowers. So there's genetic differences. Some go later, some go early, and no matter where it's at, they're going to have that genetic difference. And then there's environmental differences. If you get a really, really bad drought in August, yellow poplar will start turning red, and they'll drop their leaves really, really early. Oaks, I observed that this fall. There was yellow poplar, raining down out on the trails. I'd be out on them on the weekends, and the oaks don't do that, so that's a genetic difference too. The poplar wouldn't have done it, but they drop early when it gets really, really dry, and other trees aren't capable of doing that. So it's more of a survival thing. Like, okay, it's time to get rid of the leaves. It's just way too dry. It could even happen in the middle of the summer if it got really, really bad and dry. So there's of course, then a range of everything in between that. So it's environment and genetics, and but the overall signal is the short days. Like already with the yellow poplar that went early, it was the short days forming the abscission layer in them, and then the dry moisture moved it up. Like I said, it can move it a week or so early, and they'll come down.
Okay, well, I think that does it for questions, and I really want to thank you so much. This was a great presentation, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Yeah, no problem. Happy I could do it.
Yeah, it's great.
Zoom. Yeah.
We had about 50 people here tonight, and pleased to have them so much exposure to your extraordinary knowledge. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Have a good rest of your night. I
Thank
know it's
you.
gonna get really cold here.
Lots of really great comments in the chat box. Everybody's saying thank you.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.